Welcome to this session of Planet Unplugged, where we're going to be talking about coral reefs and coral reefs in the framework of the 2020 biodiversity future. So to get things started, I'd like to say thank you to all of you for coming to this very important session, and I hope it's going to be extremely informative. We've got three amazing speakers, and I would just like to introduce them to you now. First things first, though, I'm Monica McDevitt. I'm the Deputy Director of the Ecosystems Division at the UN Environment Program here in Nairobi, and I'm also the Acting Head of the Marine and Coastal Ecosystems Branch. So I'd like to introduce the panel to you who you'll be interacting with today. First off, we have Mr. David Obura. David is the Director of the Coastal Oceans Research Development in the Indian Ocean, otherwise affectionately known as CORDIO, East Africa, based in Mombasa here in Kenya. He's the chair of the IUCN Coral Specialist Group, and he's worked with and supported a lot of coral reef work and worked with organizations such as the Worldwide Fund for Nature, UNEP, of course, and the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network. He's passionate about this, as evidenced by his 30 years of work on coral reef research and management globally. So welcome very much, David. We appreciate your taking time to do this. Emily, it's fantastic to see Emily. Emily and I crossed paths when I was at Cambridge at UNEP World Conservation Monitoring Center, so welcome. Welcome to Nairobi. Nice to see you again. Emily is also a coral reef specialist, and she's worked with the International Coral Reef Initiative, ICRI. She has a background in biodiversity assessments, translating science to policy through accessible information. She's a marine environmental policy specialist and has worked on ocean governance. Emily has a long history of working with FAO, through UNEP WCMC, one of our other partner organizations, Grid Arundel, and most recently she was the Deputy Secretary of the OSPAR Commission, which is the Regional Seas Convention for the Northeast Atlantic. So welcome, Emily. We really appreciate you coming here. And last but certainly not least is our Executive Director, Inga Anderson. I think most of us know Inga, but perhaps for those of you who aren't UN Environment Program staff, Inga was recently appointed as Undersecretary General and Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Program recently. Prior to this appointment, she was the Director General of IUCN in Gland, Switzerland. And she has worked previously with the World Bank, and she's worked in amazing places like the Middle East and in North Africa. She's an economist originally by training, but I think a passionate environmentalist overtly. So it's obvious that the environment is your passion, Inga. So welcome to the panel, and we do thank you for taking this time out of your very hectic and busy schedule. So without further ado, I just want to introduce a little bit the work of the panel today. They're going to give very small sort of notes around what they are working on, why it's important, how it fits in with the biodiversity framework, where we need to look in terms of priorities, and how each of their groups can contribute and how we can work better together. I'll give the floor first to Inga to perhaps set the tone and to give us a few steers in terms of the direction perhaps that UNEP is going. Inga, over to you.
Well, thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Now, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be here together with these two brilliant panelists on my flank. You will hear all the science and all the latest substance from them. Just to say that if we ever had a time where we needed to focus on coral reefs and understand the absolute imperative of their protection, it is now. Many of you will have been following news events and coral bleaching, reading about ocean acidification, understanding ocean warming, and seeing what that is doing to these very, very precious resources that generate, in terms of what we invest in them. I think there was a study not so long ago done by UNEP that showed that we had invested in about a 4-year period $1.9 billion only. And then looking at the return that these coral reefs generates to humanity, we are talking 300 billion at least. Remember that the coral reefs, while they only really take up 1% of the sea surface, so we have to understand that they are taking, in terms of species, is it what, 20% of 25% of species. So the imperative, this is where our fish spawn, this is where our richness occurs in terms of aquatic biodiversity. And obviously, in a climate changing world, whether we like it or not, coral reefs also act as a protector of breaking waves. Now, this is also when corals are destroyed, but nevertheless, they play a very important nature-based solutions in a climate-changing world. All of this to say that the work that we need to do and the kind of language that we have in Aichi Target 10 that defines the imperative of protecting these precious resources, one of the takeaways that I take, and you heard me on the opening of the open-ended working group, is that we can indeed strengthen that language and think about baselines and think about targets more clearly. And I hope that that's part of what the open-ended working group will be doing. But you asked me about what UNEP is doing, because my colleagues on both sides will say much more about the imperative and the importance of these magnificent resources. And so just to say that in UNEP, which have just arrived a couple of months ago, but I'm really, really pleased to see all the work that's already ongoing on coral reefs. I think it was in 2018 that we published this coral reef economy study. Some of these numbers, which I quoted, that show the incredible underlying ecosystem service in real and evaluation of that service that coral reefs provide. I think we were told in that study that, well, unless we take care of these reefs in Indonesia, we stand to lose a potential of $37 billion worth of income, Mesoamerican reef, 35 billion, etc. So the truth is that they play this important role. I mentioned that funding is woefully inadequate considering the 375 billion per year funding gap that there is, and considering the ecosystem services that these reefs provide. So at UNIA, we've had important resolutions that have highlighted the imperative of protecting coral reefs, actually all the way back from UNIA 2 through UNIA 4. We're particularly pleased with the collaboration that we do have with the IUCN specialist group on coral reefs that we do have with ICRI, as well as with a whole host of other initiatives and that are underway to ensure coral reef monitoring, not least, of course, the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network, where ICRI is very much a partner, where obviously the data from the Red List plays a huge part. And we're very much aware that in the context of understanding and furthering coral reef protection and investing in coral reef protection, the International Coral Reef Symposium, which will take place, I think, next year in Germany, unless I'm mistaken, which gathers 2,000, 3,000 people. It's one of these fantastically nerdy events. So if you are a coral reef person, this is a place you want to be, because there's everything you ever wanted to know and then some about coral reefs. A big conversation that is happening now is, of course, artificial restoration of coral reefs, which is an issue that has been quite controversial in settings, and I think that's one of the issues that I would encourage my fellow panelists to speak to, since that is certainly a conversation that will come up in the context of the open-ended working group and in the context of the Bremen conference that will happen next year. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Inger, and thank you for setting the scene on this. I think what I'll do is I'll turn to David and ask you to perhaps give a little bit more information about your background and perhaps about Cordio, the organization, but perhaps you want to discuss and tell us why coral reefs are really so important to make sure that we conserve, that we protect, that we take care of, in addition to the kind of things that Inger has spoken of, and perhaps how your organization is doing that.
Okay, thank you, Monica, and thanks for the invitation to be on this panel and to all the attendees in the audience. So, yes, I work for Cordio East Africa. We're a non-profit company registered here in Kenya, and we've been working about 20 years. But we work at the regional level. We're very much in the context of the International Coral Reef Initiative and how that's supporting the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network. And then in the context of the global coral reef community, both on the science side with the ICRS, the conference and the society, the global society, as well as with IUCN, the WWF and the other NGOs working on coral reef conservation. So the work that we do in this region is very focused on coral bleaching, climate impacts, starting in 1998 with the first sort of global coral bleaching event, and then also on community-based fisheries and the small-scale fisheries on coral reefs, and especially how coral bleaching and climate change is affecting the ability of reefs to sustain people and uses, and the recovery ability, which is a major issue with increasing impacts to coral reefs, increased warming, increased uses, and I guess declining resilience of reef ecosystems. So how do we deal with that process in a management context and in national contexts? So that's what we tend to focus on. I've been very active so in IUCN in establishing the Coral Specialist Group because I think 12 years ago now, not so much to have a focus on corals as species, but really on the ecosystem dynamics and the importance of the ecosystem to people. and the whole issue being dealt with in the 2050 vision, which is really how do people, because of the high pressures on coastlines in tropical countries, how do you try and balance human needs with the dynamics of this ecosystem, which is very fragile on the one hand, but also, of course, very productive and resilient in many ways. But of course, that there are limits to what nature can sustain. So, in the context of this setting in the open-ended working group, we have supported coral reef monitoring in the region to a large extent because as scientists, obviously, that's something we work on extensively. But it's becoming increasingly clear that we have to have a much stronger direct line from science and monitoring and data to conventions and decision-making processes. That monitoring needs to target local needs because it's always done at the local level, especially until now with people in the water. That, of course, will change with new technologies and automated technologies, but still you need a huge investment of people in looking at the health of a system, what's happening with it, and what does that mean to them. So we need monitoring to suit local needs, but then we also need to be able to aggregate that data to higher and higher levels at subnational, national, and regional and international levels to understand the state of a system. So because of the GCRMN has been in place for 20 years now, it turns out, as much as we decry the lack of information, the lack of data on coral reefs and other tropical systems, it's actually quite an advanced ecosystem in terms of the scientific understanding and some of the data sources that are available. We've focused a lot on biological monitoring, of course, over the years, and that's been the focus of many of our organizations. But then also monitoring on social and economic sectors has increased over the years, both in the scientific community and the GCRMN. The SOCMON program has been running in certain regions, not globally, but in certain regions for that time. And the challenge of aggregating, understanding local dynamics of systems, but in using indicators or using data that can be aggregated into coherent indicators at larger scales it's a big challenge for biology. It's an even bigger challenge for social and economic factors, and particularly getting beyond monetary value of nature's services and the benefits we get from nature. So that's really becoming the focus of what we're turning to as an organization, and I think that reflects the interests of the broader community. It's certainly not a unique thing that we're doing. And I certainly have a number of points on the urgency of doing this for coral reefs, on how we think we might try and do this under the framework of this post-2020 discussions. But perhaps I won't launch straight into that, but let that come out as we have some more questions and discussion amongst us. Thank you.
Thanks, David, for those opening remarks, and we'll get to some probing questions and make things interesting, I hope. So, Emily, if you just want to sort of open from your side and set the scene, you've done a lot of work with monitoring and indicators, and that was a bit of a nice segue that David gave you there. So why don't you pick up from that and perhaps tell us why, and put in perspective, it's really important to monitor and to find the right indicators around coral reefs, because what is that going to tell us? So just set the scene for that, and then we'll open up the conversation.
Maybe just to start, if I may, just talk a little bit about the International Coral Reef Initiative and explain what that is doing. So the International Coral Reef Initiative is it's quite a unique partnership. It's an informal partnership, but it brings together countries and organizations around a central theme of coral reefs. And it's a global organization. So it has a really good convening power to bring together all the partners who are involved in working with coral reefs and have interest in coral reefs. And it's that convening power which is now being used to see how to work with the post-2020 process and see how to use this process to help further the actions to stop the decline of coral reefs, which has been alluded to, is an urgent issue. All the major assessments from different sectors are pointing to coral reefs as facing crisis, whether it's the FAO reports talking about food and agriculture, or whether it's the IPBES reports that are pointing out the global biodiversity decline. And one of the important things that we need to be able to do, of course, as you've just mentioned, is understand where we're going with things, and understanding how things are changing, how we can measure the actions that are being taken, and see that there is a change and an impact on the ecosystems that we're so dependent on. At the moment, there is the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network under ICCRI, which David is very much involved in, is preparing a new status report, which will be available in 2020 to support the work of ICCRI and also into the post-2020 process. And that'll be the first report that has been launched since 2008. So it's been quite a gap in having a global picture of the world's coral reefs, and it will be a really important contribution to our understanding. There's also quite a lot of work as well about trying to get a wider understanding, not only of the biological aspects, but also trying to measure the importance of pressures that are acting on coral reefs and how we can monitor those, but also the dependence of society on the benefits that are derived from coral reefs. There's a lot of promising work going on in this area, which may not be ready necessarily for 2020, but hopefully the process that will come out of the post-2020 framework will be one that allows for evolution over time to take up these new elements. So there's a lot of work going on, and the International Coral Reef Initiative community has identified that this is a really important moment, and there's a working group or an ad hoc committee that has been established within ICCRI to make sure that the coral reef community can come together and can put forward a proposal of how coral reefs should be appropriately taken up in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, and to ensure that this global guidance for further action is continued.
Great. Thank you for that, and thank you for setting the scenes. So what I'm going to do now is perhaps ask a few provocative questions, open it up to the floor for a bit more of the same, and then I'll ask you guys to give us your take on them. So, I'm a Canadian prairie girl. I grew up in the center of a continent, thousands of miles away from any water. And, why should people beyond the coast be concerned about coral reefs. We've talked about the benefits, and we've talked about, you know, the dire state of the biodiversity, that it accounts for 25% of biodiversity. But you know, as a landlubber, you know, I go to the coast to see how pretty they are. But what benefits would I get if I, you know, spent my whole life in Texas or in Saskatchewan? Why should, you know, all the people away from the coast be so concerned about coral reefs? So maybe just open it up with that, other than all the statistics and that sort of thing. But what else do coral reefs really provide for us, other than perhaps ecotourism?
Well, one thing's medicines. So if we're a long, long way from the sea, living in the prairies, and you get sick, then maybe actually the coral reefs may be the answer to helping you recover from that illness. So there are all sorts of novel compounds which are being found in coral reef organisms, which, this isn't my area of forte, but I believe there's a diverse array of drugs that are being developed to treat cancers, I believe, and a whole array of very common diseases. Yeah, there's some crazy creatures down there, and they produce crazy chemicals, which can't necessarily be replicated yet, or will need further work to. But yeah, that's one thing you'll get. So maybe I'll just take one and pass it down.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, I think I'm very glad that Emily mentioned medicines, because the same question can be asked about why should the prairie girl care about, you know, the biodiversity in Kenya, you know, other than you like to see pictures of the big five or go on safari. I think essentially this broader story, yeah, there is the utilitarian aspect to diversity, which is important, but I'd hope to think that that prairie girl also cares about nature itself and the abundance and marvel at which this nature exists. And the fact that its very existence, that she is part of that broader universe. And in a way, the sort of marvel of diversity is one that transcends the utilitarian, the rights of species to also have existence. And are we in dominion, or are we part of? And that's sort of a broader, more philosophical discussion. But I'm sure that prairie girl cares about that. Over and above that, I would say she probably eats fish from time to time. And chances are that they're not all freshwater, and they may have a heavy carbon footprint coming all the way to wherever she's at. Nevertheless, chances are that those fish have spawned, well, maybe not in northern Canada, but nevertheless, the protein, the fish protein that feeds humanity is incredibly important, and spawns and lives and in much larger abundance than beyond the coral reef. So there's some real realities here. And then one fine day, this girl goes on a trip and she sees it, and from thereafter she's hooked because she's seen something that is extraordinary and magnificent.
Okay, thank you. I guess I'll go a little bit back to the more mundane, but I think so that the prairie girls shouldn't sort of poo-poo the ecotourism value either, because if you do choose to go to a coral reef, I mean, depending on the size of your family and where you choose to go to, you might be spending anywhere from $3,000 to $10,000 or $12,000 of your hard-earned income to go to that coral reef area. And so that's a very strong personal economic choice. And we have ignored the strength or the size of the tourism sector to our peril, I think, in looking at coral reefs. And I think we're suddenly realizing that it is either one of or the biggest economic sector globally in terms of tourism and where people go and what they spend their money on. And of course that sustains jobs locally and all sorts of other things. But the second thing I think that we are realizing now as well is that the coral reefs are perhaps just they're a thermostat. They're a canary in the coal mine for what may happen to your system. Perhaps, you know, the next year or in the next 10 years, we don't know. There's so many unanticipated impacts of climate change that if we allow climate change and the degradation of a system to go to the level at which coral reefs decline significantly, predicting exactly what the impacts might be to the systems that really matter to you locally may not be very well developed. There could be some really big and very costly surprises just around the corner.
No, thank you very much for that, David, and I like the analogy you made, because a lot of us have heard about, the great forests of this planet being the lungs of the planet, and we know what's happening to them, sort of right now burning, unfortunately, and being cut down. And so to hear that perhaps the coral reefs can be looked at as a thermostat or a harbinger or canary in the coal mine kind of analogy helps to put things in a little bit of perspective, I think. So I'm not going to monopolize the time.
If I can just pick up on that. So just to say something a little bit more out there as well from that. So we're trying to explore the use of this. I mean, so if we save coral reefs, particularly with a climate dimension, if we save coral reefs, we save everything else, basically. Okay,
that's a great bottom line. Okay, so I'm not going to monopolize, but I will prod the rest of you out there. So you've had a chance to listen to what we've started off in this conversation. So I'm turning it over to the audience. Please ask your questions. We have a roving microphone that can go around here. And when you ask a question, please just identify yourself and where you're associated. Thank you. Because otherwise I'm going to keep asking more questions.
Afternoon, everyone. My name is Birgi Lamizana, and I'm at the Ecosystem Division. On your presentation, you really talked about the benefit we are gaining from the coral reef, including medicine and all the related services it provides to humanity. I wanted, as I have the opportunity to have you here, to really dive also into what is, and this is linked to the question, the probing question from Monica, how do we make sure that the activities we are doing on the ground has more or less impact on the way the coral reef is functioning, all the, for sure linked to climate change, but also linked to pollution. What is when you are living in Mombasa, for example, and I'm living upstream, what is the main, let's say, 3 main actions each of us could do to really prevent of degrading our coral reef, and what can we do also to help them kind of recover and sustain? So I want at least to have your view and dive on that. Thank you.
Okay, can we perhaps take a second question so we can keep the conversation going?
Hello, my name is Masha. I'm with the Pew Charitable Trusts, and my question is about restoration. I know we briefly touched on that, but just like what is the latest exciting news on what we're doing to restore coral and replant, and is that really a viable option?
Okay, great. Thanks, Marcia. And we have a question over here.
In connection to the first question that we had, I was wondering if we have active projects that are ongoing upstream in relation to, if I may use Mombasa, the way she used. Are there projects that are aiming to clean Nairobi River? Because we know it goes all the way down to Mombasa. And we know what happens at night, the industries and the raw sewage.
Okay,
so are there projects that are ongoing on this particular river?
Just tell us who you are too.
Oh, my name is Nathan. I'm from Policy and Programs Division.
Great. Okay, so we've got 3 interrelated questions there. Who would like to start off?
I'll give it a whirl. So, I mean, obviously, on the first question, it's very much, well, they're all sort of related. So, so actions, act, speak up, engage, speak to the local community, vote. Make sure that those who are the land planners, the enforcers, the environmental protection agencies, I speak beyond Kenya, obviously, the folks that ensure that standards are in place, do their job. And if in countries they are bored off, speak up about that. Because we know that pollution loads, we know that effluents, we know that releases are very critical. So that's one bit. 2, deal with illegal fishing. enhance and ensure that where we have overfishing and illegal activities, that is spotlighted, name and shame, when we know for sure. Because part of that is part of the story that undermines our reefs. And three, obviously, fight climate change. We have to decarbonize our economies, and the oceans, unlike the terrestrial, will uptake the CO2, whether we like it or not. In terrestrial, we have to plant the trees and have the biomass. The oceans just do it. And so that CO2 is essentially turning our water, our oceans into soda water, an exaggerated point. But the acidification that's taking place is serious, combined then with the global warming. Now, on the issue of restoration, I'm very keen to hear my colleagues speak on this, but I think that if it is an event that is sort of an event that has happened, that is not a progressive increasing climate event, whereby obviously the canary in the coal mine will eventually die. We have seen some interesting work on this. I am not in favor of sinking old drilling rigs and some of these things, but there have been some interesting work that have been quite finessed. It's in my view, but I'm very interested to hear David and Emily, some interesting, intricate and sensitive low-level construction upon which coral organisms could rebuild, but not sink old junk into the ocean and just wait for something else to attach itself to it. But this would be my 2 cents. I don't know who will go next after me.
Okay, thanks. So I guess I'll back up what Inge has just said on some of the actions that need to be done. And I would say, so I live in Mombasa, and I'm just outside on the open ocean front, but the water comes out of the creeks around Mombasa. And the pollution load going into the creeks is just phenomenal. And that's because of the lack of waste collection, solid waste, liquid waste, all sorts of waste, but also vegetation clearing on land, and also loss of the mangroves fringing the coastlines. So it really takes making systems work, and that's the importance of the governance processes as well. So those agencies that are supposed to collect waste or to promote recycling or to find people for littering and things like that need to work. And speaking as a Kenyan, we need to vote, to make that happen in whatever systems we work in. And it's the same with the question asked from over there in terms of what projects are being done. There's been a lot in the Kenyan press in the last few weeks about pollution in the Nairobi River. One of the main rivers that comes through Nairobi as a city. It ends up in the Athi River, which ends up on the coast, spilling out there, and the pollution loads are very high. So we need landscape management, and things that we do on land affect coral reefs very strongly because they're right at the fringe of the sea. And then, of course, decarbonizing is the most important thing. We have to do that to take away the large-scale pressures. We have to do everything locally to minimize impacts of economic and development activities, whether it's pollution and other things, extraction, fisheries. We have to understand the limits of the system and apply that knowledge, and then to apply the legal systems to keep things in place. So environmental impact assessments and the sort of due diligence that goes with development projects really need to be strengthened across the board, particularly in developing countries where pressures are growing so fast. And we need innovation in all of these sectors to understand how to emit less carbon, how to pollute less, how to recycle more, so much less gets thrown out. Waste from any one process becomes an input to the next process. And I think in business terms, circular economy principles, I think, are really the way things need to go in terms of reducing our impact as consumers, as people that consume things into the environment. I will just say a word on restoration. It is a huge topic in coral reefs and marine systems right now. Of course, restoration in terrestrial ecosystems has been quite advanced. We've been experimenting with it for hundreds of years, thousands of years in many cases, and we can see much more easily what's happening with restoration. It's much harder in the sea to see what's happening and to have to be able to act over a large spatial area. The amount of effort that goes into planting individual corals and trying to get them to grow, is huge. And if you haven't taken away the threats that killed the reef off in the first place, the same threats are going to be to act on the new corals. But there are a lot of innovations that are happening in coral reproduction. In Australia, we've heard a lot in the press recently about the ability of scientists to harvest larvae during spawning events to keep them safe in aquaria so they don't go through this, 99.99% mortality that happens in nature. So if you can reduce mortality to 50% and then put those larvae out when they're ready to settle, you can have many more young corals. But of course, you have to do that in a context of reducing the pressures that are damaging the reefs in the first place. There's experimental work on basically, on the genetics of corals, trying to promote super corals, getting genes that are more stress resistant, temperature resistant into corals and so on. It's all, we need to have innovation. The thing is that at the moment, I think the general wisdom is that we need trials, we need innovation, development of techniques, but you can't go and promise that you're restoring the reef of a community and they'll get better fish and so on. It's much better to spend that money on community development and finding alternatives and giving direct benefits to people that are sustainable. But if we don't develop the restoration techniques now, we're not going to have them in 20 or 30 years when we really are going to need them. If we do the Paris Agreement, we will lose still most of the reefs that are still alive now. If we improve conditions for reefs, if we reduce carbon so that we meet the 1.5 Celsius threshold, then we will then be in a position to repopulate, or conditions will improve for corals. So if we then have restoration techniques that take 20 or 30 years to develop, then there could be a chance of increasing the coral cover and the extent of reefs around the world in this brave new world that we've got to. But we need a lot of transformations to get to that place.
I'm going to go backwards. I'm going to start with picking up on your points on restoration, David, and then come back to what it is that we can do. And just building on what you were saying about needing to remove the pressures first, restoration can't take the place of other actions. It has to be done in addition and appropriately. So where there have been actions successfully to remove the pressures that cause the problem, but also consideration of what it is that you're restoring. So what is the aspiration for this restoration? What are you trying to do? What functionality, which benefits do you need for the societies that are depending on them? And I think there's a lot of work still to do there in terms of how to even begin to address the complexity of coral reef ecosystems and the communities that they are home to. And is that something that's replaceable? To my understanding, knowledge, they're much more simple structures that have been able to be restored. Small areas, more simple, less function, fewer benefits. There is a lot of exciting work going on, and the application of the work that you were talking about to remove some of the risk and loss of the young larvae, and then using artificial intelligence and drone technologies to disperse more widely than can be done by humans swimming around. And there are all sorts of I've been quite interested in seeing some of the kind of more entrepreneurial and innovation opportunities that are springing up to try and address some of these problems, which I think is quite an interesting area as well, to spark ideas and to tap into other communities, to tap into the design communities and the engineers and get some different aspects of the problem solving as well, which is quite interesting. In terms of what it is that we can do, we all have professional roles and we have things that we can do in our professional lives and address some of the bigger picture issues. We also have our personal responsibilities as a member of society. And there are things that, in addition to the things that Inga and David mentioned, David, you mentioned also things like consumerism. It's how are we acting? How are we advocating a sustainable life how we can live within the planetary boundaries, and how we contribute to that ourselves. So what is it that we're putting down our drains? What are the products that we're using? How much of them are we using? How much are we wasting? What can we rethink what we're doing? And I think there's a lot that we can do in that also contributes, in addition to some of the bigger scale actions. And then I left it to last, but it's because I find it the most interesting. How do we connect what's going on in the land and the sea? How do we join the institutions and get connection between the institutions that are responsible for policy and implementation in terrestrial issues with marine issues? There are huge separations still in the communities, in how we talk to each other, engagement, interministerial. It goes from public policy to industries. And I think one of the biggest challenges over the next period is if we can overcome some of these silos, if we can work out how to work in different ways that bring together these different communities to solve common problems, to recognize the value of how nature and how coral reefs are of benefit to us more broadly as society, that we can come together to try and find some different ways forward. Because continuing as we are, I think, in continuing in our institutional silos and our thematic silos and talking to each other because we all agree with each other, versus reaching out and working out how we can not only talk with, but collaborate with and find new approaches with the others. We shouldn't have others. We should all be addressing these problems that affect us all. So I think it's a challenge for the next implementation phase, but one that I hope we'll find a solution to, because I think it's what's been tripping us up.
Great, thanks for that. And if I just sort of recap, basically everything is connected. Perhaps we all know that intuitively, but we don't often communicate it particularly well. So just simple things like everything is connected. We need to understand how systems work. And secondly, that there really is no single solution, no silver bullet solution to make all the reefs come back. David very nicely, helped us understand that yes, it will take time, but we have to do other things while we're working on innovation. And so there is no single cure. We can't just reverse acidification. It's not like your swimming pool where you can put some chemical in it and turn it around. This is a long-term effort that we have to make because it's taken us, it didn't happen overnight. So we do have to look at multiples of solutions. And I think finally, the message has come through very clear that each and every one of us can make a difference by personal choices and taking personal responsibility. So there's a lot that we can do, and there's a lot that we can put pressure on. And maybe that's an area where I want to go next, which is perhaps more relevant to the group here and what's going on in terms of the post-2020 biodiversity framework. We all talk about the research to science, science to policy, policy to implementation, natural progression. But from a policy perspective, where do we really need to focus? How do we influence the influencers when it comes to making sure that we get the things going in the right direction in the people's hands who have the ability to make those kinds of leadership decisions on our behalf? So perhaps we can just open it up and ask a few questions from the audience. What are your thoughts and concerns around policy issues? We're all working in that realm. It's happening, as we speak. Where would you like to see things go? And what are the questions that you would like to ask the group around sort of policy issues? Questions from the audience? Okay, I see two hands up, one here and one in the back.
Hi, thank you. I guess going back, perhaps looking back to the implementation of Aichi Target 10 that Inger touched upon, I think it might be useful to see what components we might need to see strengthened or in addition to, or that they haven't really worked well on the work on the ground, but also at the policy level. So I think that would be really useful to hear from you as well.
Okay, great question. Who are you? Where are you from?
Sorry, yes, I'm Marina from WWF.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi there, Ariana from Ecosystems Division. You've mentioned Australia and now you're mentioning policy. So I'm just wondering how ICRI is influencing national policy when maybe the assessment, environmental assessment saying that building a coal mine next to the Great Barrier Reef is not a great idea, but it still goes through policy and is accepted. So what's ICRI's position on that and how are they influencing those decisions?
Great example. Okay. Other questions? Okay, let's carry on with those two in the policy realm.
Thank you. I'll take the direct question to ICRI. I don't have any ICRI position. I'm a consultant to ICRI, and so I'm afraid I can't speak on behalf of ICRI on that. However, what I should say is that ICRI itself is a partnership between the countries and the organisations, and they sit together at a table and discuss issues related to coral reefs. Australia are actually one of the co-chairs of ICRI at this moment and up until 2020, and are very active in that work. So I think it's a very good example of some inconsistencies in national policy, and also I think links back to the point previously that there is a greater need to have increased consistency across not only national policy but regional and global as well. And then the second question was HE Target 10. So this had successes and failures. I was able to do some work looking at the experiences of coral reef countries in implementing this, which came out in December. And it was a very interesting piece of work to do. So that what it was able to achieve for some of the countries that have coral reefs is that it provided a tool for them to prioritize coral reef issues in their policy arena. And it's something that also achieved that between government periods as well. So it could transition, it could retain some consistency, across government sittings. So it was able to bring attention to coral reefs, and it was able to provide some consistency in national policy. However, it's also come out repeatedly in the assessments of HE targets as being one of the worst performing. And some of the reasons attributed to that are the fact that it's very complicated. It's difficult to work out what it is that you as a national actor are meant to do. It's also impossible to measure. And then there's also the fact that it had a 5-year time frame, which when you're trying to change institutions and you're trying to change behavior of institutions to be able to address pressures which come from different sectors is an impossible time frame. So I think it's something really important to think about in preparing for post-2020 is requiring ambitious, yes, but it has to be grounded in reality and understanding of the time taken to create the changes that are necessary. That also makes me a little nervous, and I will finish on this, because of the time pressure. The fact that, the chance that by the time we get to 2050 and the vision of living in harmony with nature, we may have virtually no coral reefs left.
Okay, thank you. So I guess I'll just segue straight on from what Emily has just said, in that in some ways I think actually HE Target 10 was ahead of its time, because it did mention the things that have to change from climate vulnerable ecosystems point of view. So the climate system and also the multiple local pressures. Now we have the SDGs, and the SDGs actually speak to each of those different areas, and countries have adopted the SDGs, the UN system has. And what you need to affect change is a theory of change, is a model that actually explicitly states, if I want to achieve X, I have to do Y, and the various steps along the way. And I believe that if we can, so coral reefs are a great model ecosystem because we understand them quite well. They're very attractive and charismatic and very visible to us and very vulnerable too. So if we can construct essentially an SDG model of coral reefs through healthy corals and fish populations, they sustain X jobs and livelihoods, this amount of economic output, sustainable tourism. You need a certain amount of education, good governance, you get certain health and nutrition outcomes and poverty alleviation. You can actually specify a model for how this all works in a coral reef. You can identify measures and metrics and cause and effect relationships. And you can go out and actually measure what's changing and what your decisions, the impact your decisions have not only on the health of the reef system itself, but on the benefits that it's providing. And so what I hope is that in developing a model like that, focused around the SDGs, and there's been a lot of talk about the cohesion that needs to be between the post-2020 framework and the SDGs, is that we can actually establish some of the mechanistic links between our economic and societal activities and health of a natural system in order to affect change. And that change needs to be laid out on decadal timescales to 2030, 2040, and 2050 for the sorts of changes we hope to have by the end. So I think it's possible to do HE Target 10 much better, and we have a lot more tools in our toolbox to enable us to do that. Now we just have to have the commitment and the vision to put it in place, and then to, of course, follow up and really enforce what we need to do.
So just to add to what the colleagues here said, in 2010, we didn't have the Paris Agreement. In 2010, we didn't have the SDGs. And when we did the Paris Agreement, we didn't understand sufficiently nature-based solutions because the primary issue was on decarbonization, and rightly so. I mean, don't get me wrong. But like with everything else, we become wiser as maybe we're pressing that panic button. And we can see that everything is connecting to everything. Maybe because the impacts that we're seeing on our ecosystems is faster, more furious than what it was the day before. And the good news then, if there is any good news in all this misery that we're sitting here talking about, is that the SDGs broadened out and didn't compartmentalize the environment alone, but spoke to the sustainability nature, spoke to community well-being, spoke to rights on education and gender and development and opportunity and jobs and infrastructure in a sustainable setting. The challenge then for us is to weigh all of that up, not to make nature the last sort of thing that gets the crumbs on the table, because nature underpins all the other bits, society and economy. And now with the Secretary General's Climate Summit, and some of you may have been present for the event that we did last night, where not because of, because as we all know, ecosystems are referenced, and adaptation, ecosystem-based adaptation, has a reference point into the Paris Agreement, but it has never been blown up to its full potential. And what I am extremely pleased about is that now in the summit, this track that deals with nature-based solutions shows that nature can provide us that breathing room while we're decarbonizing, while we're researching, while we're doing all of this. Let's invest as much as we can in nature. And what the Secretary General is calling on is for member states to come with ambitious, greater, to stretch the ambition of the NDCs. And what we in a coral conversation should be speaking about is remembering that corals are part of the NDC story. And therefore, the interconnectedness of decarbonization, of depolluting, now I'm back into the SDGs, of climate change, of sound ecosystem management cannot any longer be fragmented. And so these NDCs becomes critical. So that aspiration is one thing that I would really stress. And the last point is, you will have heard me speak about an ambitious post-2020 framework. Ambition is easy, it's for the birds. You know, we can all agree on something super ambitious. The question is it rooted in will? And there, this is where I challenge the environment community to speak to beyond the environment community, because we know that the drivers of impact are not necessarily always within the environment community. Certainly the climate drivers are not. And the drivers of pollution are at times, in terms of regulatory settings, within the environment community, but is underfunded, under institutionalized, if I could say so. So I think being smart about how we as an environment community leverages our messages into a broader setting is absolutely critical. That's how we'll get people to speak up. That's how we'll get them to vote. That's how we'll get them to move towards circularity and personal responsibility. And I think that's part of the broader solution. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I think that was a very inspirational way to start winding down this conversation. So I'll go to the floor one more time. If that's inspired you to think of more questions, please raise your hands now. Anyone out there? Oh, I see one hand, yes, right in the middle.
Hi, my name is Alex from the Civil Society Unit. Mine is just a comment on policy. During the just concluded CPR meeting, the Colombian delegations had suggested that we need to change our policies to involve more of the stakeholders, major stakeholders and NGOs in policy making. And we also need to change our policies from the Paris Agreement. I think the US pulled out of it. We need to change the mentality of our policies from the how does it benefit me to the how will it benefit us. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that reminder, and that we all have a stake in this, and we all have to take this from a collective position. One more question, fantastic.
Good afternoon, my name is Malin Omondi from UN Environment Ecosystems Division, and my question is more community level. How is the community, the ones who directly benefit from the resource, how are they engaged in terms of conservation of the resource? And if they've been engaged, what are some of the positive results of that kind of engagement? Thank you.
Thanks, Malin. Maybe David can give us one concrete and very Kenyan example.
Okay, yes, thanks for the question. So on that, so in Kenya, as in most countries in the region, many countries in the Pacific as well, I'm sure in the Caribbean, we are working very hard now on locally managed marine areas, on capacity building, so governments are devolving responsibility. Traditionally, governments have taken very centralized control on natural resource management and control. And so realizing with especially growth in population and a lot more interest on the ground, and it's much more complex, is really to devolve responsibilities down to the grassroots level. We have what we call beach management units. Of course, there are many challenges of resources and capacity, and also declining health of fish stocks that fishermen depend on. But as NGOs, all of us working in this sector have worked very strongly on, one, the science and understanding the system, trying to describe what's happening well enough to help inform the process. But then also working on participatory monitoring, for example, so that communities are much more engaged in actually collecting the data that shows the health of their system, both for their own insight as well as for them to be able to show that to other stakeholders in the government. And then also being able to take decisions on protected zones, either no-take zones or temporary closures of octopus in particular has been very successful in many places because they grow so fast when they're released from fishing pressure. So there's a lot of tangible examples. Many of them are very localized in extent, and so there's a lot of work now on building up the networks amongst communities, so to give a stronger voice as well, so they can speak for themselves at broader contexts. In this forum, you hear it very strongly now. There's very active and strong fisher community networks and associations that are active in Africa, particularly led from South African experiences, but also extending to East African now. So there are many very tangible actions coming in now, but it's really a race against time. There's so much cultural change happening at the grassroots level as well, with immigration and people moving from different parts of the coast or inland to the coast as well for jobs and opportunities and taking up fishing. So it can undermine traditional practices, traditional sort of ways of controlling effort or relieving pressure on the sea. So it is a continuous challenge, but there's a huge amount of investment in it, and both government and non-government sectors are very strongly engaged, not just here, but I think all around the world now, and that's to be encouraged, particularly in these processes. Lastly, I will note I was involved in the IPBES process, and I was really, especially as an ecologist, really heartened to see how strong the voice of indigenous peoples and local communities was in this global process, and that this is being heard much more strongly, because I think, of course, it does need to be increasingly and much more than today, in fact.
Great. Well, thank you very much. That was a fantastic concrete example. So I think what I'd like to do is wrap up this session, unless there's someone who's just had a spark and wants to ask a question. But I do want to thank especially our Executive Director, Inga Anderson, for her valuable time that she's given us today. And I think her insights and her enthusiasm has rubbed off. And the Prairie Girl will take your comments to heart. And perhaps one word from me, I did spend a lot of my time working on how living things adapt to environmental stress, land-based, plants and things like that. But that was 35 years ago. And only now are we starting to see the more widespread use of plants, particularly, that are adapted to higher temperature living or salt stress, all of the things that I worked on, freezing stress, frost stress, and all that sort of thing. It takes a long time. So we do have to have multiple work streams in place to make sure that we, A, learn from the past and hasten some of that learning. And I see that that's happening with coral reefs as well, is that there's opportunity, but we also have to learn and work very purposefully in a particular direction. So again, thank you, Emily. Thank you, David. Again, thank you, Inger. And thank you, all of you. Let's give our panel a nice round of applause.